The morning sun had just started warming the busy streets of downtown Boston when Dr. Maya Richardson joined the line at Sunrise Coffee Shop. The familiar scent of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air as she checked her watch. 6:45 a.m., right on schedule. She needed to be at the hospital by 8 o'clock a.m. sharp for her first surgery of the day. Maya had her morning routine down to a science. As one of the few black female neurosurgeons in the city, she'd learned that preparation and punctuality were her best allies. The coffee shop was already buzzing with its usual morning crowd. Nurses finishing their night shifts, office workers trying to grab their coffee before the rush, and college students cramming for early morning classes. She stood patiently in line, scrolling through her patient's latest test results on her phone while absent-mindedly adjusting her cream-colored blazer. The shop's warm lighting caught the silver stethoscope charm on her necklace, a graduation gift from her grandmother who'd always believed in her dreams, even when others didn't. The line moved slowly but steadily. Maya didn't mind. She deliberately left home 15 minutes earlier than necessary, knowing the morning rush could be unpredictable. She watched as Mrs. Nguyen, the shop owner, expertly crafted drink after drink, somehow remembering the regular customers' orders before they even reached the counter. The elderly Vietnamese woman had owned this place for 2 decades, and her coffee shop had become a beloved neighborhood institution. Maya could smell the vanilla and cinnamon from the drink being prepared ahead of her. Just 3 more people to go. She'd been standing there for about 15 minutes, mentally rehearsing the complex procedure she'd be performing later that morning. A tumor removal that required exceptional precision. That's when she felt someone brush against her shoulder. The touch was subtle but intentional. Maya looked up from her phone to find a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit trying to edge past her. His leather briefcase alone probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd had that particular look she'd seen countless times before, the kind that suggested he was used to people moving out of his way without question. "Excuse me," he said, though it sounded more like a command than a request. "I'm running late for an important meeting. Would you mind?" He gestured for her to step aside, as if her own time and place in line were somehow less significant than his rushing morning schedule. Maya felt the familiar flutter in her stomach, that moment of decision that so many people like her face daily. Should she keep the peace and step aside? Should she speak up? The weight of her hospital ID badge against her chest reminded her of who she was and everything she'd worked for. The coffee shop's usual morning chatter seemed to dim slightly as nearby customers began to notice the interaction. A young barista paused mid-pour, watching the scene unfold. The businessman's expensive watch glinted under the shop's lights as he impatiently shifted his weight from one polished shoe to the other. Little did anyone know that the seemingly ordinary morning at Sunrise Coffee Shop was about to become anything but ordinary. Maya took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to respond. The next few moments would transform a simple coffee run into something that would have the whole city talking. The businessman's request hung in the air like morning mist. Maya took a moment to study his face. She'd seen that look of expectation many times before in her career. People often assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the lead surgeon, or mistook her for support staff instead of the department head. But today felt different. Maybe it was because she'd spent the previous evening mentoring young medical students, reminding them to believe in themselves. Or maybe she was just tired of the subtle daily pushes to make herself smaller. "I've been waiting in line just like everyone else," Maya said, her voice calm but firm. She noticed how his eyebrows shot up slightly, as if surprised by her response. The businessman, who she'd later learn was James Barrett from the financial district, shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather shoes. "Look," he said, his voice taking on that particular tone that suggested he was trying to be reasonable while being anything but, "I've got a meeting with the board in 20 minutes. Surely you understand." He glanced around, perhaps expecting others to jump in and support him. But the morning crowd at Sunrise Coffee Shop remained surprisingly still, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion movie. A young woman in scrubs behind Maya cleared her throat supportively. An elderly man reading his newspaper lowered it just enough to watch over the top of his reading glasses. The usual coffee shop chatter had dropped to a whisper, making the hiss of the espresso machine sound unusually loud. "I understand completely," Maya replied, maintaining steady eye contact. "I'm due in surgery in an hour. Someone's mother is counting on me to be there on time, fully prepared." She paused, letting that sink in. "Your time isn't more valuable than mine or anyone else's in this line." Barrett's face flushed red, starting from his neck and creeping up to his cheeks. His grip tightened on his briefcase handle until his knuckles went white. It was clear he wasn't used to being refused, especially not in public, and especially not by someone he'd expected to simply step aside. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The morning sun streaming through the coffee shop's windows caught the silver name badge on his suit jacket, making it glint like a warning signal. Maya felt her heart racing but kept her exterior calm. Years of performing delicate brain surgery had taught her how to keep her hands steady even when under pressure. "I don't," she replied honestly. "But I also don't see how that's relevant to respecting the basic courtesy of waiting your turn." The tension in the coffee shop was thick enough to cut with a knife. Behind the counter, Mrs. Nguyen had stopped wiping down her beloved espresso machine and was watching intently, her hands gripping a cleaning cloth. Two college students who'd been arguing over their economics homework fell silent. Even the usual morning rush traffic outside seemed to have quieted down. Barrett opened his mouth to respond, his face now a shade of red that perfectly matched the coffee shop's logo. But before he could speak, something unexpected happened. Something that would turn this ordinary morning confrontation into a moment that would be talked about across the city for weeks to come. The entire coffee shop was about to witness a turning point that none of them, especially not the impatient businessman in his expensive suit, saw coming. The coffee shop had become eerily quiet, except for the gentle hum of the espresso machines and the muffled sound of traffic outside. Barrett's face had turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized he was quickly becoming the center of attention, but not in the way he was used to. "Listen here," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge that people use when they're trying to mask their anger with forced politeness. "I don't think you understand. I have a meeting with people who could buy and sell this entire block." He gestured broadly with his hand, his gold cufflinks catching the morning light. Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind she'd experienced countless times throughout her career when people underestimated her or tried to make her feel small. But today was different. She thought about the young resident she'd mentored yesterday, a bright woman who'd confided in her about feeling out of place in the medical field. Maya had promised her that things would change, one small stand at a time. "Actually," Maya responded, her voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear, "I understand perfectly. You believe your time is more valuable than mine, than everyone else's here." She gestured to the line of people behind her, the nurse still in her scrubs from the night shift, the teacher grading papers while she waited, the construction worker in his safety vest. The young barista behind the counter had stopped pretending to clean the already spotless counter. Two teenagers who had been scrolling through their phones now looked up, completely absorbed in the scene unfolding before them. Someone's phone camera light blinked red, recording. Barrett stepped closer, using his height to try to intimidate her. "Do you have any idea what kind of decisions are made in my morning meetings? The kind of money that's at stake?" His expensive cologne couldn't mask the scent of privilege that seemed to ooze from every pore. Maya stood her ground, her comfortable surgical shoes planted firmly on the coffee shop's worn wooden floor. She thought about her patient waiting at the hospital, a young teacher with 3 kids who trusted Maya to remove a tumor that other surgeons had deemed too risky to operate on. "Yes, I make decisions in my meetings too," she replied calmly. "The kind that determine whether someone's mother gets to see their grandchildren grow up, or whether a father gets to walk his daughter down the aisle. She paused, letting her words sink in. So please, tell me more about the importance of your meeting. A soft murmur of approval rippled through the coffee shop. Mrs. Nguyen had moved closer to the counter's edge, her wise eyes narrowed as she watched the scene unfold. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the floor, like nature itself was drawing a line between right and wrong. Barrett's hand tightened around his leather briefcase until his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he struggled to maintain his composure. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in such a public way. Several more phones had emerged from pockets and purses, their cameras capturing what was quickly becoming more than just a coffee shop confrontation. The tension in the air was electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Everyone could sense that something unprecedented was about to happen, something that would challenge not just one man's sense of entitlement, but the very dynamics of power and respect in their community. And that's exactly when Mrs. Nguyen decided she'd seen enough. The gentle squeak of a swinging door cut through the tension as Mrs. Nguyen emerged from behind the counter. Despite her small stature, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down far worse than an angry businessman in her 70 years of life. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back in a bun, and her crisp apron bore the coffee shop's logo she had designed herself 20 years ago. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that reminded customers of her journey from Vietnam to Boston decades ago. The entire coffee shop fell silent. Even Barrett, who had been about to speak again, closed his mouth and turned to look at her. Mrs. Nguyen walked slowly but purposefully toward them, her comfortable shoes making soft sounds against the wooden floor. She'd watched this scene unfold while preparing drinks, and something in her eyes suggested she'd seen similar situations play out many times before. "Young man," she addressed Barrett, though he was probably in his 40s, "in my country, I owned nothing." She gestured around the coffee shop. "Here, I built this place from nothing. 20 years, I watched people come and go." Her voice was gentle, but carried unmistakable authority. "Rich people, poor people, doctors, students, all wait in same line." The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to soften, casting a warm glow around Mrs. Nguyen as she spoke. A young woman in the line wiped away a tear. The construction worker who had been pretending to check his phone was now watching openly, nodding slightly. "Every morning," Mrs. Nguyen continued, "I see this doctor." She gestured to Maya. "She waits patiently. Never asks to skip, even when she has surgery. Always has kind word for everyone." She turned to face Barrett directly. "But you, first time in my shop, and you think your money makes you better." Barrett shifted uncomfortably, his expensive shoes scuffing against the floor. The red in his face had changed from anger to something else. Embarrassment, perhaps, or shame. His grip on his briefcase loosened slightly. "In Vietnam, I learned something important," Mrs. Nguyen said, her voice taking on a teacher's tone. "Real power isn't in making others feel small. Real power is in lifting others up." She paused, looking around at her customers, the regulars who had become like family over the years. "In this shop, we are community. We respect each other." The coffee shop had transformed into something more than just a morning stop for caffeine. Every person there could feel it. They were witnessing something profound. A teenager who had been recording everything on his phone lowered it slowly, too captivated by the moment to worry about social media. Mrs. Nguyen turned back to Barrett, her expression softening slightly. "You want coffee. You wait in line like everyone else. Or," she gestured toward the door, "there is coffee shop around corner. Maybe they let you skip." The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Everyone waited to see how Barrett would respond to this gentle but firm challenge to his worldview. His expensive suit suddenly seemed less impressive, his power less absolute. In this moment, in this humble coffee shop, The usual rules of power and privilege were being rewritten before everyone's eyes. The silence that had fallen over the coffee shop didn't last long. A young woman near the back of the line, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, cleared her throat. She was wearing a name tag from the nearby elementary school, her hands still gripping papers she'd been grading while waiting. "I see this kind of thing all the time," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Just last week, a parent tried to push past our school secretary, saying they were too important to wait for a scheduled appointment." She looked directly at Barrett. "But you know what? Every child in my classroom learns that respect isn't about how much money you make." Her words seemed to break a dam. A construction worker who had been standing quietly in line spoke up next, his orange safety vest bright against the coffee shop's warm wooden walls. "20 years I've been building this city's skyscrapers," he said, gesturing out the window at the towering buildings. "Every day I see folks in fancy suits look right through me, like I'm invisible. But you know what? Those buildings don't go up without people like me." Mrs. Nguyen nodded approvingly, her presence still commanding attention even as others began to share their stories. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. A college student who had been typing on her laptop looked up, her eyes bright with recognition. "Last semester, I did a research project on workplace discrimination," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger. "But reading about it in books is nothing like seeing it happen right in front of you. Thank you," she looked at Maya, "for showing us how to stand up with dignity." Barrett's expensive suits suddenly seemed to hang differently on his shoulders, as if the weight of everyone's words was physically pressing down on him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably that important meeting he was running late for. But for the first time that morning, he didn't reach for it. An elderly man who had been quietly sipping his coffee in the corner spoke next, his voice carrying the wisdom of years. "I've been coming to this shop every morning for 15 years, he said, adjusting his glasses. "I've seen all kinds of people come through those doors. But you know what makes this place special?" He gestured around the room. "It's not the coffee, though it's excellent." He nodded to Mrs. Nguyen with a smile. "It's that everyone who comes here is treated the same." The atmosphere in the coffee shop had transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become something else entirely. A moment of community, of shared understanding. People who normally hurried through their morning routines, barely making eye contact, were now looking at each other with recognition and solidarity. A young nurse still in her scrubs from the night shift wiped away a tear. "You know," she said, looking at Maya, "I needed to see this today. After a long night of taking care of patients, sometimes we forget that we deserve respect too." The morning light continued to fill the coffee shop, warming the space with a golden glow. The usual sounds of the city outside, car horns, construction noise, the general bustle of urban life, seemed muted, as if the world itself was paying attention to this small but significant moment in a neighborhood coffee shop. The weight of the moment seemed to physically transform Barrett. His shoulders, which had been squared with self-importance just minutes ago, slowly dropped. He looked around the coffee shop, really seeing the faces of everyone for perhaps the first time that morning. The buzzing phone in his pocket suddenly felt less urgent than the realization spreading across his face. He started, then stopped, as if the words he usually relied on had abandoned him. His fingers loosened their grip on his expensive briefcase, and he set it down carefully on the floor. The simple action seemed to symbolize something larger, the setting down of assumptions he'd carried his whole life. Barrett turned to face Maya, and his voice had lost its sharp edge. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words coming out slowly but sincerely. "Actually, I owe everyone here an apology." He glanced around the room, making eye contact with the construction worker, the teacher, the nurse, people he might have overlooked any other day. The morning sun caught the edge of a tear in his eye, something that would have mortified him an hour ago, but now felt right. "I've spent so many years thinking my time was more valuable than everyone else's," he continued. "My meetings, my deadlines, my priorities." He shook his head slowly. "I never stop to think about the surgeries you perform." He looked at Maya, "or the buildings you construct." He nodded to the construction worker, "or the children you teach." Mrs. Nguyen moved closer, her wise eyes watching this transformation with quiet approval. The espresso machine hissed softly in the background, a gentle reminder that this was still just a neighborhood coffee shop where an extraordinary thing was happening. "You know," Barrett said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have a daughter. She's 12. Every day, I tell her she can be anything she wants to be." He paused, swallowing hard. "But what kind of example am I setting when I act like this? When I teach her that some people's time matters more than others?" A gentle murmur of understanding rippled through the coffee shop. The college student who had been recording everything on her phone slowly lowered it, recognizing that this moment was too genuine, too human for social media. "The coffee here," Barrett smiled slightly, looking at Mrs. Nguyen, "probably tastes better than the fancy place around the corner anyway." A few soft chuckles broke the tension. "Would it be all right if I—" He gestured to the back of the line, "waited my turn." The construction worker made space behind him, offering a small nod of respect. The teacher who had spoken earlier wiped away a tear, her ungraded papers forgotten in her hands. The elderly man in the corner raised his coffee cup in a silent salute. Maya stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Richardson," she said warmly, "and I think there's room in this line for everyone who's willing to wait their turn." Barrett shook her hand, the gesture representing far more than a simple greeting. Mrs. Nguyen began making her way back behind the counter, but not before patting Barrett gently on the shoulder, a grandmother's touch that seemed to say both, "Well done," and "It's about time," all at once. The morning sun had risen fully now, bathing the coffee shop in warm light. Outside, the city continued its busy morning rush, unaware that in this small corner of Boston, something profound had just happened. A small moment of transformation that would ripple out into the world in ways none of them could yet imagine. By the time the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Boston's busy streets, the morning's events at Sunrise Coffee Shop had taken on a life of their own. The video, captured by the college student, had already started spreading across social media platforms. But unlike the usual viral confrontations that often filled people's feeds, this one was different. It showed something rare and precious, a moment of genuine human transformation. The local news station had sent a young reporter to the coffee shop. She stood outside, microphone in hand, while the afternoon regulars squeezed past her to get their coffee. "What started as a confrontation over a spot in line," she reported, "has become something much more meaningful to this community." Inside, Mrs. Nguyen was busier than usual. People were coming in not just for coffee, but to be part of the shop that was suddenly famous for all the right reasons. She handled the attention with her usual grace, telling customers, "Good coffee takes time. Good change takes time too." Maya's phone hadn't stopped buzzing all day. Between surgeries, she found messages from other doctors, nurses, and hospital staff. "You did what we've all wanted to do, read one message from a fellow surgeon. But you did it with such dignity." Her patient's surgery had gone perfectly, perhaps because she'd walked into the operating room that morning feeling stronger than ever. The construction worker who had witnessed everything had shared the story during his lunch break. By afternoon, it had spread across every construction site in downtown Boston. "You should have seen it," he told his coworkers, perched on steel beams high above the city. "This doctor, she stood up for all of us who get looked past every day." The teacher had returned to her classroom with something new to teach her students. Sometimes, she told them during their afternoon lesson, the most important things we learn aren't in our textbooks. They're about how we treat each other. At his office, Barrett had called an unexpected meeting. His employees found him different, humbled, more human. "I learned something important today," he told his team, his voice carrying a new kind of authority. Not one of power, but of honest self-reflection. We've been so focused on the value of money, we forgot about the value of respect. The college student's video continued to spread, but with comments that were surprisingly hopeful. This is what change looks like, one popular comment read. Not with shouting, but with dignity. Another noted, watch how the whole community came together. This is what we need more of. Local coffee shops across the city began putting up small signs. Everyone's time matters here. It wasn't planned or coordinated, it just felt right. The movement spread organically, like ripples in a pond after a single stone creates the first wave. A popular morning radio show picked up the story. What happened in that coffee shop, the host said, is something we rarely see nowadays. A moment where someone's mind and heart actually changed. No shame, no cancel culture, just human beings recognizing each other's humanity. By evening, when Mrs. Nguyen was wiping down the counters and getting ready to close, a young girl came in with her mother. The girl looked around the shop with wide eyes, then asked, "Is this where the doctor stood up for herself?" Mrs. Nguyen smiled, pointing to the spot near the counter. The girl stood there for a moment, standing as tall as she could, imagining herself being just as brave one day. The day was ending, but the story was just beginning to spread its wings. In homes across the city, families were talking about it over dinner, discussing what they would have done, sharing their own experiences, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, things could change, one coffee shop line at a time. 3 months had passed since that transformative morning at Sunrise Coffee Shop. The summer heat had given way to crisp autumn air, but the warmth of what happened that day continued to glow throughout the community. The shop had become more than just a place for coffee. It had transformed into a symbol of what could happen when people chose to stand up with dignity and respond with grace. Every Friday evening, after closing time, Mrs. Nguyen would host what she called community conversations. The idea had started spontaneously when Maya and Barrett both happened to come in one evening after work. Instead of avoiding each other, they'd sat down and talked, really talked, about their lives, their struggles, their hopes for their community. "We need more of this," Mrs. Nguyen had said, listening to their conversation while wiping down tables. And just like that, a new tradition was born. The next week, the construction worker joined them. Then the teacher. Soon, the Friday gatherings grew to include people from all walks of life. Executives, nurses, students, delivery drivers, all sitting together, sharing stories over Mrs. Nguyen's special blend coffee. Barrett had undergone the most visible transformation. He'd initiated a new policy at his firm requiring all executives to spend time volunteering in the community. Success isn't just about the bottom line, he told his board members. It's about lifting everyone up. His daughter, who now stopped by the coffee shop every morning before school, watched her father with newfound admiration. Maya's simple act of standing her ground had inspired others. A quiet revolution of dignity was spreading through Boston's coffee shops, offices, and hospitals. People were sharing their own stories of standing up with respect, of choosing courage over comfort. The local newspaper called it the coffee shop effect. How one moment of brave dignity could spark lasting change. Mrs. Nguyen had hung a small framed photo on the wall. A snapshot someone had taken of that morning. In it, you could see Maya standing tall, Barrett beginning to understand, and Mrs. Nguyen bridging the gap between them. Under it, she'd placed a simple sign. "Respect is our special blend." The college student who had recorded the video was now doing her thesis on how small acts of courage can transform communities. She often sat in the corner of the coffee shop, interviewing regulars about how that day had changed their perspective. The most powerful moments, she discovered, are the ones where people choose to see each other as humans first. One crisp autumn morning, a group of medical students shadowing Maya asked her about the incident. Standing in the hospital hallway, she smiled and said, "You know, Medicine isn't just about healing bodies. Sometimes it's about healing the way we treat each other. Her words echoed through the hospital corridors, touching hearts just as surely as her skilled hands saved lives. The construction worker had started a mentoring program, bringing young people to his work sites to learn about the dignity of building something lasting. Every brick we lay, he would tell them, is about respect. For the work, for each other, for the community we're building together. As winter approached, Mrs. Nguyen's coffee shop remained a warm beacon of hope. The morning regulars now greeted each other by name. People held doors, shared smiles, and waited their turns, not out of obligation, but out of a shared understanding that every person's time and dignity mattered. 1 year to the day after the incident, Maya walked into Sunrise Coffee Shop and found a surprise. Every customer standing in line wore a small pin that read, "Standing Together." Mrs. Nguyen just smiled from behind the counter, her eyes twinkling with the knowledge that sometimes the smallest moments can create the biggest changes. In this simple coffee shop, they had all discovered something profound, that real change doesn't always need grand gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes, it just needs one person to stand their ground with dignity, and a community brave enough to stand with them.